All right, hello everyone. So we are joined again. So we've got Bryn, Vegan Foot Soldier, Shadow Starshine, and Perspective Philosophy here. Now we're continuing our debate from last time, where Perspective Philosophy, Bryn, and Foot Soldier were here. Where we were discussing name the trait, whether or not it's an actually coherent argument, and we're just going to start off from last time. And I think the main topic of contention was, explain it again, Bryn.
Well, so the big one that seems to be problematic right now is this idea that name the trait breaks the law of identity. And the idea is that I think that not only does the argument not break the law of identity, but that the law of identity that it supposedly breaks isn't problematic for the conclusions of the argument. But I'll let them explain their contention in more detail.
Yeah. Obviously, we're arguing for the identity of indiscernibles and arguing that if we equalize every ontological property of a being, then we will break the identity of indiscernibles, in which case we would have only had one object to begin with. But before we can do any of this, obviously, I think we talked about this, Bryn, we need some concrete definitions of what trait equalization is, and essentially an understanding of the argument before we can get into the nitty gritty. And yeah.
Yeah, I'd say I'd have something to say about this because since we actually live streamed the day before yesterday, can you all hear me right? Yeah, I think I turned myself up a bit to where I was yesterday. Yeah, so since we live streamed the day before yesterday, Ask Yourself has presented a formal or seemingly formal rebuttal to our rebuttal. And in that, he rejects premises 4 and premise 14. And the thing is, everyone was saying, do you have a supporting argument for, well, Brim was saying, and Vegan Games was saying, do you have a supporting argument for premise 4? Well, the whole thing about this syllogism, and I don't need to really be protecting this syllogism, I'm not really fighting for the syllogism, but it's just getting us sort of like started, it's a starting place. And the thing is, if you reject P4, that's fine. I don't need to support it. I don't need a supporting argument. You can just reject it. It's fine. Just reject it. And 14, if you don't think it works, okay, just reject it. That's fine as well. But the thing is, if you reject P4 and if you reject P14, then I no longer have any comprehension. I cannot comprehend what the trait equalization process would even look like. I have no idea because I'm speculating, because all this time no one's actually been clear on what the trait equalization process actually even is. So in that syllogism, that polysyllogism that we put together, the rebuttal to name the trait, we were just speculating, what is the trait equalization process? Could it be this? Could it be that? Well, it has to be this or that. It can't really be anything else. But now Ask Yourselves come along with his formal rebuttal and said, no, it's not that and it's not that. Or if it's not either of those, that's fine. You can reject that. That's fine. I don't even need to bother supporting the argument. You can just reject that. That's fine. But it now means I have absolutely no idea what the trait equalization process looks like, in which case I am going to need a supporting argument for premise 1 of name the trait, because I just don't understand what it means now. I'm just rejecting that as incoherent nonsense because I can't comprehend what it would actually look like. So Bryn, you're here instead of, I don't think Ask Yourself is going to come on the stream, so you can talk on his behalf, I'm hoping. Can you supply us a supporting argument for premise 1 of name the trait?
Yeah, just give me a moment. Let me just pull up. Do you guys have access to the Google Drive that has?
Yeah.
I think we've all looked at the documents. There's a new document here.
Can you link it again in the chat just so I can bring it up
Yeah,
again?
yeah. I'm just pulling it up. I'm just pulling it up in Ask Yourselves Discord. 1 second. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm not used to using Skype. Okay, I'm just gonna message you, Richard. There you go. So there's the Google Drive that has.
You can't just link it in the group chat.
I don't know where the group chat is.
It's just the conversation button on the bottom right.
Gotcha. Skype is weird.
There you go.
Okay, there you go. Okay.
There we go.
Yeah, so there's the Google Drive. The Google Drive should have. It has both Ask Yourselves visual explanation of the trait equalization process as well as the most recent formal argument.
So are we standing by that animation? Like, are you guys defending this as a true representation of what you think the process is?
For me, I like to look at it more in terms of set theory, or we could go about looking at it in terms of like possible worlds, or we could look at it in terms of like a program. Almost the best way to look at it is a pass by copy, array copy.
The problem that I'm having with this new version 1, which has just been uploaded yesterday or the day before yesterday, is the fact that it seems to be at odds with the original animation. So the original animation seems to be a metamorphosis, whereas this new version, version 2, but it's actually entitled version 1, this seems to be this iterations in parallel worlds, and so that would be the premise 14 in our syllogism, and the original animation would be the premise 4 in our syllogism, and you've rejected both. So you're saying it's not a metamorphosis, it's not the iterations in parallel worlds, or are you just rejecting that the consequent is related to the antecedent there? Are you rejecting the P5s and the P15s? Like, what, can you be a bit more specific on what you were rejecting there?
Well, so the first thing we should do is, if we're going to get back to the polysyllogism, I thought we were going to ignore, but if you want to get into it, let's pull up the polysyllogism quickly, and let's look at the exact wording of P14.
P4. Again, guys. Before, this is what me and Shadow said. I think would be a good idea, is rather than work out, rather than focusing on the polysyllogism and whether we're rejecting P4, P14 before we do any of that.
Yeah, I might
see the definition of trait equalization. If we have a solid definition to go off, then we can work out. If you tell me that trait equalization is something that I did not think it was, and this P4 is clearly wrong, then you can just point at P4 and go, you see, because trait equalization is this, P4 must be wrong. Okay, that's got to be the case.
Exactly.
Yeah. So rather than bounce Bryn around, if we just focus on getting more proper definitions, we'll sort out a language game. We'll start so we're all talking the same words. We all mean the same things, and then we'll build.
Cool. Yeah, the only reason why I said about the P14 and P15 share, we don't need to bring up the syllogism. The only reason why I was asking is whether he was rejecting the fact that the trait equalization process is indeed iterations in parallel worlds, or if it's a metamorphosis. So I'm assuming we're now rejecting the fact that it's a metamorphosis. We're now accepting the fact that it's iterations in parallel or impossible worlds, right? So we've now, that's what I'm asking, right? So what actually is it? Do you know, Bryn?
1 second. I think that if I'm speaking from this point on in the debate, it'll be my opinion instead of Ask Yourself's opinion. I think that needs to be clear.
If that
Ask Yourself was invited.
If that differs significantly from Ask Yourself's opinion, then he will need to contact us, hopefully not by actually coming on the stream, because that's a disaster, as we know, but by actually
I think he's welcome.
notifying.
Absolutely welcome.
Yeah, he's welcome, but I think it might be dangerous to. It might just be steamrolling again, but hopefully it's not. Let's give him a chance.
Look at it like this. If Isaac wants to defend his own argument, of course Isaac should be allowed to defend his own argument. Okay?
Yeah. All I don't want is another steamroller.
But I think I agree with your general point there, Foot Soldier, is that Bryn's interpretation of what the argument isn't endorsed by Ask Yourself, and Ask Yourself is the originator, so that would be problematic.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah. So he's welcome to come on, mostly. I'm not.
I could just ask him on Facebook right now. He might reply back. So what specifically should I ask him?
Just ask him if he wants.
Nothing just yet.
Just ask him to define trait equalization.
Or just tell me if Bryn's speaking for him. Whatever Bryn says is accurately whatever.
Yeah. But basically, if he just diverges from Bryn at any point, then he can just message you and say, no, Bryn's chatting shit, or Bryn's got a different opinion. So
we've kind of come to the conclusion that a lot of this is Isaac hiding in the ambiguity of it. You see.
Yeah, definitely.
So what we don't want is we argue, we talk with Bryn, we'll come to a conclusion that everyone's happy with except Isaac, and Isaac just says, no, all of that was nonsense, I hate you all. You know, and I think that's just what we want to avoid.
Yeah.
And since it's his argument, if he says there is a correct way for it to be interpreted, then I'll accept that. But then he has to state it.
Jasmine just said that Ask Yourself went to the gym.
Yeah.
He's typing
We'll see
in
if
his
he-
Discord.
Well, we'll see if he'll respond.
I mean,
back
unless
on
he's
Facebook
typing on his
eventually.
Discord and working out at the same time, then I have doubts.
Well,
Well, it
I
might-
mean,
It might just be that he has no audio set up, right?
Well, he could just message me on Facebook. I asked him if it's name. Oh no, he's messaging me back right now.
Yeah, you could just leave YouTube running and listen whilst you're doing the workout, I guess. But, I don't know.
I mean, in the meantime, let's
I just
Brendan.
asked him if trait equalization is a metamorphosis or parallel worlds.
So I think that we could probably look at the evidence of the fact that he has recently released what looks like a parallel worlds example. So if you look in that Google Drive,
I agree.
there's
I agree, but I feel it's at odds with the original, which seems to be a
Let Bryn
metamorphosis, but that's
speak.
still up.
Let Bryn speak. I want to hear Bryn, man.
Yeah, sure,
so-
man, sorry.
so I
Okay.
think that
Yeah, it seems like it's a parallel worlds thing. I'll bring it up on stream so everybody can see. Just give me a moment.
Yeah.
I think that's a pretty accurate interpretation because you do have World 1, World 2, World 3, World 5 with the trait equalization process. So I'd say that seems like a pretty obvious way to interpret it.
And so, and given that, I'm assuming that when we look at just to ask us the question, that we can all be happy that when we look on the dialogue tree, if we reject P1, it does say it is assumed that if all traits true of one object are equalized to those of another. So if it says that all traits true of one object are equalized to those of another. So this is a possible world scenario in which there is a possible world in which all traits are equalized simultaneously, and that it is not.
I don't know. Okay, I don't know if they all have to be equalized simultaneously because I'm looking at P1 right now. If your view affirms a given human trait is equalizable to a given non-human, where in that does it say all traits at once have to be?
It says if you go down
equalized?
if you go down. So if you say the argument is unsound. So if you were to go like a given human is not trait equalizable to a given. Well, you could say like it's incoherent to say that a given human could be trait equalizable, right? Then it goes to P1 is false, and it says it is assumed that if all traits true of one object are equalized to those true of another, that any traits remaining after equalization are possessed by both objects.
Where's the simultaneousness out of that list?
Well,
just to clarify, I think what is sort of being conflated here is the difference between simultaneity and full trait equalization.
Yeah.
So to derive a contradiction, you do require full equalization.
Yeah.
But there isn't simultaneity because it's an iterative process. So you're stepping through each separate trait, and you're asking, is this the thing that grounds moral value, or these groups of traits?
He said, sorry to interrupt, but then he said that you have to deal with all the traits simultaneously, otherwise, you have to deal with the stack simultaneously. That's what he said.
Otherwise, it's a straw man.
Oh yeah, that's what he said.
No, he
against,
said fully.
rationality
He said
proofs.
full. No, he says it has to be fully equalized, not simultaneous. I think Bryn's right. It's iterative.
Yeah. I think the simultaneity might be with respect to like conjunctive or disjunctive trait stacks, where you're saying like, look, it's the emergence of all of these traits together that are required. So it's like you have, for example, like it's sentience and humanism and living in a society. Like those things in conjunction need to be done. But whether or not that means that you're operating simultaneously in like some metaphysical sense, I don't think so. I think the point is just that if you take, so you have like, so if we look at this mathematically, right? If you have like, 4 traits, that means that there's like 16 different possible combinations that we could come to, there's 4 factorial different combinations that we could come to about like how many different trait stacks there are. And all Ask Yourself is saying is that we have to look at all the different trait stacks to be charitable to someone about like what it could be.
The only thing
but that's
the only
like
thing-
that's a rejection of P2, right? Like the P2 is to say that my view doesn't support this because there's this that trait. But the P1 is a necessary material conditional that the consequent can always obtain if those conditions are true. And I'm doubting that they can always be the case because I think there are traits that you can't equalize.
And that's fine. If that's where we want to jump into, I think it's clear that what it means to reject P2 is just to quote unquote name the trait, and then the secondary argument would get into something like that's absurd for X, Y, and Z reasons, and so the vegan would deliver a response like, well, here's an argument. Here's an argument where if you name that trait, that entails that small children are being killed or Superman is being killed, etc. But if we want to say that now we're at this point where the claim is that there are certain traits that would show that P1 is false, we would have to get some kind of argument for that.
Right. So I mean, I can dig into that, but
sure.
I think both me and you we said this before on Discord that we should probably talk about what we think is at stake for the argument, because a lot of people seem to think there's a lot more at stake than there actually is. I've really only said that if this particular, me and Lewis made a video about Name the Trait where we made a few objections. Some of it's with the conversation tree, some of it's with the writing. I mean, this is really the only one with the writing, except for the one that was fixed in the last version, with the whole X's and Y's and all that. But that was fixed. The only thing that's at stake, if I end up being right, is that you guys just make a few word edits and then literally nothing changes.
No, I agree. And so one thing I was going to mention before we really start to get into this is when I'm working through philosophy, I tend to take a hermeneutic approach. And so I like to say, look, here's the conclusion that they're coming to. What can I do that maximizes my ability to arrive at that conclusion? So I want to be as charitable as possible. And I'm not calling you guys uncharitable. I think the point just is that at best, sort of what we arrive at with the arguments that's been lobbed so far is that you're right. It would just be a few word changes, and that the very essence of what Name the Trait is doing is still going to be retained. Because it seems.
I agree. Because I've said that.
Yeah, because is it not worth saying within this, what is the difference? What would you say was the conclusive difference between the argument from marginal cases, just for the audience as well, the difference between the argument from marginal cases and Name the Trait? What would you say was the specific conclusive difference between the two arguments?
I think it's the iterativity. So with the argument for marginal cases, what Peter Singer is doing is saying, there are these characteristics. So, for example, if you look at animal liberation, what he's saying is you could claim that, for example, black people shouldn't have rights in virtue of their melanin, right? But what he says is that there's obviously other characteristics that overlap in African American individuals that would cause us to say that they should have some rights. And so, for example, their sentience, their capacity for pain, their desire for freedom, etc. Those are things that are marginal to both groups. And so the difference is what Ask Yourself sort of done with the argument for marginal cases is said there has to be something that is concretely different about these groups that doesn't overlap at all, and that the way that we can discover that is through an iterative process, which he calls the trait equalization process. So what it is it's got a bit more force to it than the argument for marginal cases, and it also, Foot Soldier and I have gotten into this discussion recently that it seems like what Peter Singer, from his perspective, is only talking about is abilities. What Ask Yourselves responded to me before is that the whole idea that we open it up to trait as a concept in its entirety is it's a little bit more philosophically open. So you could have people that say, look, the trait is the fact that it exists in fictional universe, phi gamma delta. And that would be a thing that Peter Singer might not say, well, that's a trait that you could name. So it's a little bit more open. It has a little bit more force. And the iterativity of it is a little bit more conducive to, I think, something like a street epistemology or a debate around the rights of animals.
And I know I'm on the outside of this opinion with perspective philosophy and foot soldier, but I don't disagree with that. I actually do think name the trait it can be useful, even though I'm against the wording.
Yeah.
I think there are, like, for as a self-reflection tool, I think there are cases where it can be useful. Now, I still have objections as to, you know, some of the absurdity endpoints and some of the, you know, the way the conversation tree flows. But like the general overall heart of it is like I've never been against it.
You see,
yeah.
I think the main difference
Yeah.
between me and Foot Soldier and Shadow is that me and Foot Soldier are vegan, and we want strong arguments that end in a conclusive in a conclusion that shows that an animal should be of moral value.
Right.
And that's something that Shadow has no stake in.
Right.
Yeah.
So one thing
This is
I
true.
would point out is that lately in my personal activism and epistemology, what I've been doing is running something I call like a name the trait, Korsgaard name the trait pincer, where you run name the trait, and so you get to the point where either they're acting contradictorily and you can explain to them why that would be a problem, or they've named like some kind of absurd trait, or they just can't name a trait at all and they're confused about what's going on. And then what you can do is you can move from that to something like a Korsgaardian argument to actually derive animal sentience itself as something that is relevant and causes animals to have rights. So you can offer.
This is the bamboozle.
Yeah, so you can offer a pro argument for animal rights, and then if the response is something like, okay, I grant that animals have sentience, but what about this characteristic? You can run name the trait again. And so it ends up being something like a pincer where name the trait breaks down whatever the fuck they're saying, and then Korsgaard can build up the animal case. And so those two things working in tandem.
Yeah, but then what I feel like you're doing then is you're a moral objectivist, right? So you're making a positive claim. You're actually doing philosophy. You're making a positive claim for the valuation of animals. That's something that I would say is what I would do in like me everyday philosophy. I'd say, well, okay, like what is it that you think's justified? Like I would argument for marginal cases, and then if they say something like like I don't know, having been made in the image of God, then we're going to have a debate about like the theological force behind that and whether that actually entails like moral value. And that's something like obviously I think that's fair. Like but I think that's entirely possible with the argument for marginal cases. Like I think that.
I think I'd like to chip in my perspective on this because I think my perspective differs slightly from you guys, the problems that I have with it. So I also find marginal cases a useful argument. The problems that I have with name the trait is that most people think that name the trait is marginal cases when it's not. It's something about a trait equalization process. And I feel like the trait equalization process just convolutes stuff and makes stuff
I would agree.
a bit odd and hard to understand, to the point where people literally don't understand it who are actually apparently using it in
I think
debate.
it's pretty straightforward.
I think it's okay. The problem I have is with the only a contradiction can exist afterwards. Like I get the whole iterative process. It's just,
Well,
I don't think that consequence follows.
I've got a bit more that I'd
Well,
like
no,
to say.
it's not that it's... Well, wait, it's not that only a contradiction can follow. It's just that, generally speaking, you are, for the most...
P1 is 100% only a contradiction can follow. That's exactly what it says.
Well, let me see.
Yeah, so
like, obviously...
see, Richard,
okay,
you're
well,
just proving that you don't even understand it because it's so fucking, like, convoluted and weird.
well, one thing I would point out, too, is that we have to be careful...
Well, it says if your view affirms a given human trait is equalizable to a given human
antecedent
non-human animal while retaining moral value, then your view can only deny that given non-human animal has moral value on pain of P not P.
Yeah, so the consequent is literally on pain of contradiction. So it's all about contradiction in P1 in the consequent. So that's literally the core of the argument.
Well, wait. That makes sense to me if you're going to claim that a given trait gives a human moral value, but if that trait is equalizable to an animal, and you deny that animal moral value, then that is a contradiction.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, but this
is where I come along, and I say, like, certain traits just can't be equalized.
Yeah,
and then,
exactly.
if you come back and say, well, then we just won't equalize those ones. then I'd say, well, then you didn't really force a contradiction, did you?
Exactly.
Well, yeah,
exactly.
and it's kind of that's kind of the point. Like the whole point is of it really is that if we are to say that a human is trait equalizable, this idea of trait equalization, rather than saying what's the justified difference, well, we might as well have said what's the justification, like run argument for marginal cases and say like there is a justifiable difference to treat animals with having lower moral status. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
And-
exactly, man.
And in which case, I could just say, like, this is the difference between humans and animals. What it's trying to say is if we were to equalize this difference, there must be a contradiction. But then by saying that we can equalize that difference, that's where the incoherency would come in.
Exactly. Yeah, that's said very well. And the further things that I've got a problem with is
just before we spin off here, I want you to clarify exactly why you think that would be incoherent. All that's saying, right, is that if I have, a set of properties A, and A equals properties A, B, and C, and I have a set of properties B, and that has the properties, D,
Also,
E,
A, B.
D,
Yeah,
E,
and then you change
D,
them to both A, B, and C.
Yeah, then we can't have some kind of disvaluation there. That those
Well, yeah,
A,
that would
B,
be
and
fair
C.
enough.
But then we're saying we can't pick the set, right? Like, this seems to be your argument, is that
You
we're
can't-
just not allowed to pick the set. Which, like, in this actual example, we'd be talking about, like, perhaps the atoms that this thing is made out of, right?
Yeah,
Like,
or
so we
like-
can say that we've equalized them to the point where, like, if we played the cup game and shuffled them around, I wouldn't be able to tell which one was which. But there's still a truth to which one was the original atoms and which one is the new set.
Well,
Yeah.
I don't think that's true, because that
Like,
that implies that what the argument is doing is operating in a way that actually constructs like some new object, and we already sort of agreed that we can interpret it under like the multiple worlds hypothesis, or alternatively what we could do is interpret the different objecthood nominally. And so if it's just nominal differences between those objects at the end, so A hood and B hood are just fictions for the usefulness of the hypothetical, right?
I understand what you're saying.
Then there isn't going to be a difference about which were the original atoms and which were the new atoms, because they will just be the same atom.
If the difference is purely nominal, right? Like if let's say that.
But then I think what would require
we would
is that
have
this difference started only nominal, but the
well,
difference
no,
doesn't
that's
start.
no. This is my disagreement. Depending upon what we mean, if we mean that we've equalized, like like for example, if I say sentience and you go, no, okay, there is a world that if I say sentience combined with self-awareness, and I basically outline like I don't know anthropocentric qualities, right? Mm-hmm. And then you say that an animal has to then have all of these anthropocentric qualities. Ask yourself, as already said in numerous occasions, that these have to be dealt with together. If they're not dealt with together, then he could run through one by one. Is it sentience? Is it self-awareness? Like, and I go, no, it's none of them individually. It's all of them simultaneously. And in which case, like,
but do you by simultaneously, do you mean that they're conjunctive or disjunctive? Like, are they sufficient or necessary criterion? Because if it's the case that they're just sufficient criteria, then he can just go iteratively and show that none of them are going to meet the threshold. Because of course, like sentience, of course, is because I think most vegans who run this are going to be sentiocentric. So they think that so they right, and so like sentience on its own is enough. I think that whether or not it's coherent to say that sentience and self-awareness can even be separated into two different things is sort of an entirely different discussion.
I mean, really, what I was saying is like more of the fact, like if let's take Shadow's position, like when Shadow originally argued against Richard, like what was your exact word in Shadow? What was it? It was humanity and self-awareness, right? Mm-hmm. Now, what I'm saying is that there would have to be a possible world in which the animal had both humanity and self-awareness. Otherwise, or either or. And if you were to say like if you were to say that it has to be done together, then the animal's only worthwhile if it's got all of the traits, or is it that if an animal is only worthwhile if it's got some of the traits? Like I that's what I kind of want to know.
This objection is to the conversation tree, not necessarily to P1.
True. It's just more of the fact like I want to know like whether trait equalization covers this.
Yeah,
well, I think it does.
It does, yeah. And I think that the point is that the discussion Shadow was in like the forefront of like the counter name the trait world, was it was trying to clarify whether or not Shadow was working conjunctively or disjunctively there, because it wasn't clear at first. But name the trait can handle either just fine.
I think that was pretty clear with vegan games.
No. I think you were clear. I think that the confusion came from the fact that it was like talked about second hand and third hand. Like I think your debate was fine. I think that like through Discord, like people can become really confused about other people's positions, and so it wasn't clear whether you were saying to some people, right, whether it was just humanity or just self-awareness, or if it's those two things together. And so I think, if I remember correctly, your position is that it's one or the other. And if it's one or the other, then
both. Like, I don't care.
Yeah. But like it's a non-exclusive or, right?
Yeah.
So the idea is that name the trait can handle the non-exclusive or, but it could also handle the and. So it could be, so like you could say,
yeah, I agree.
Like if he names those things, what someone would do is they would probably, just say, well, what about like Superman? But also Superman's like not self-aware at this point. And that's where we start to get into like some of the interesting philosophical discussions, where you sort of get into what P2 really means and whether or not people really want to like deny these sort of things.
But I mean, that's like the genetic interpretation. But unless we're going to be, just stringently evaluating me for what the hell humanity means, I mean, we can get back to to the name the train.
So I think just to be clear, like, it's not a problem with name the trait that people can say that there are both sufficient and necessary traits, because like I explained earlier, what you can do is you can just look at traits in terms of possible worlds, take all the possible combinations of traits, and then what you would just do is you'd like be going with a highlighter and saying like, look, this world has value, this world doesn't have value, this world has value, this world doesn't have value, and you would look at like what certain sets and groups of traits are the ones that have value, and why is it that the case, which we talked about the other day, is that really what name the trait is doing is it's asking you like what grounds are moral judgments.
Like and this isn't the point, right, that I've been contending. I wrote a steel man, which is that, and so I have no problem with describing it like that. My point was with the old description, the one that the circles alluded to, and ask yourselves the old description of it, which a mishmash. And I still think that even if you go with that, Steelman interpretation, that some of the wording is a misnomer, like moral retainment or equalization. They just become, confusing terms for what's actually occurring.
Yeah, I don't like moral retainment, because one thing I don't like is this whole using those words implies that there's like something like ontological going on there. Where I think that if
it's not ontological, then why did Ask Yourself say that Rationality Rules was making a category error? Like when he looked at his judgment, when he said like it's my judgment.
I haven't watched that debate, so I can't speak for Ask Yourself. If you want to get him to clarify in the future, that'd be fine. But
the way the odd position, because I actually agreed with Ask Yourself.
I know you did, but I know what you were saying was essentially like he would be making a category error if it was his judgment. But what I'm saying is that unless what he was saying in the debate is that there had to be an ontological difference to inspire the difference in judgment. It can't be purely
non. I don't actually understand what the difference would be if it's not ontological.
No. I do know that it's an ontological difference, but by ontological I mean that I don't think that the trait equalization process has to be anything but fictional. So it's just like a useful fiction that we're doing. It's not the case that we're actually.
Obviously, it has to be fictional. It can't be real, can it? But it's a thought experiment, so it's going to have to be fictional. But the thing is, it has to be coherent as well. Because if you have something which is a thought experiment but incoherent.
I'm sorry, Foot Soldier. I'm using some like Lewisian terms here. Let me try and be a bit more layman. I think that what I'm saying is like it isn't the case that there are literally these like possible worlds and that literally these exist. What we're talking about, again, it's better just to break these down into sets of properties and look at it in terms of like a set, because really what we're saying is like if a set contains A, B, and C, it's nonsense to say that A, B, and C in this case with no other differences has value, and A, B, and C in this case with no difference to the original set has a different value. That's all that name the trait's getting at.
Okay, but let's say someone was to say that, like the creation of a possible world changed the values. Like one of the examples I gave was in my video was like, the idea of like Rick Sanchez from Rick and Morty. He's from what, like C-137, like world like C-137, right? So like his valuation of himself is kind of clear throughout the whole thing. Like Rick is kind of a narcissist, self-loving, only cares about himself the whole time, at least arguably. And he kills Ricks all the time, right? And many of them may share the exact same properties as him, while existing in a separate world, right? And obviously, this is purely fictional. But would he be acting in a way that was irrational by being able to kill himself multiple times, rather than simply shooting himself in the head because it would minimize the moral damage done? So that's kind of like a question I'd want to ask, because
I wouldn't think so. He like again, one of the points of the show is nihilism. Like his belief is just nothing matters. So he's attempted suicide multiple times, by the way.
Well, yeah, he kind of like half attempts it. He never actually fully succeeds, does he? He never like.
No.
Now we're getting into the 200 IQ conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the problem is, and so I've actually been thinking about this a lot myself, is like, what is the best way? Because I have a like a way to understand this in my head, but now we're starting to get into this like territory where philosophy is just becoming like Wittgensteinian language games. And I feel like there's a sense in which possible worlds make sense to me, and I think that it makes sense to most people who are having the colloquial argument run on them. The problem, of course, is like hashing out exactly how possible worlds should be interpreted.
Okay, let's be fair, Brent. The people who are taking it colloquially are not even looking at possible worlds or whether my interpretation. They're just taking the functionality of it. It's just functional.
That's what I mean, is that there's a fictional and functional sense of what's going on with name the trait and the trait equalization process that most people get, and that the way that I view it and the way that it works in my head is through possible worlds. But I'm sort of, I think it's cheeky to say that you can refer to things like meta traits, or like refer to the fact that you used to be in a previous world. And so one way that I've been looking at this with other people is that you can.
I agree, it's cheeky, and it's almost stupid.
I do not even think it's cheeky. I think especially if you're talking to someone like an egoist, and you're talking to someone who with a concrete notion of self. I mean, you'd have to be arguing that they exist simultaneously in two separate possible worlds, not in necessarily name the trait, but to equalize like certain aspects of what is valuable. Mm-hmm. You'd have to be making like an argument in which there was an identity which existed in multiple worlds, and I think you just mentioned Lewis there. Like Lewis outright declares that's just not possible. That's why counterpart theory is a thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's sort of like, I mean, I'm a huge fictionalist about possible worlds, and so like maybe that's skewing my.
But even if it is like, even if you were like, the whole point of modal logic is to say that it is it is a necessity that it is possible. That's the. It would have to necessarily be possible, or it must possibly be necessary.
Can I say this in maybe a slightly easier to understand sense? It seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that Bryn's saying he likes to pretend that the argument's sound. It doesn't matter if it's sound or not, but he likes to pretend that it's sound. Is that too far, going too far, Bryn, or it sounds like what you're saying?
Just getting back to what perspective philosophy was talking about, really, I think that what I'm looking at when I'm talking about possible worlds is increasingly I want to say that it's not even getting into possible world semantics. I think increasingly I'm moving towards this interpretation that's like set theoretic with constraints. And so increasingly what I've been explaining to people is you can put constraints on the trait equalization process in a formal sense once we actually begin to hash out what it means. And I think the two most important constraints are you can use the terms morally relevant, and you can use the term like at the beginning of the trait equalization process.
If Ask Yourself used the terms morally relevant, we probably wouldn't be here right now.
Right, and I think that like the problem is that maybe like I think that we're just getting back to the root of the conversation, which is that what Ask Yourself is doing, the argument's clearly valid. The sense in which it's unsound, I think, is easily shored up by an exegesis. And that overall, we all sort of begin to understand at least that the argument works. And that really the only discussion remaining, which seems to be coming from Foot Soldier in the sense of it's confusing, and from Perspective Philosophy in the sense that it's not objective and it's not forceful. And I agree with Perspective Philosophy that there's a requirement for the forcefulness of the absurdity claim, but that Name the Trait works at doing what it intends to do. And that it really, like, there's not much of a problem there. And then once
I would say that's not what my position is 100%. I do think it's unnecessarily confusing and many people don't understand it, but I've also got problems with the fact that like we were talking about on Discord, that I've got this problem that you can name the density of pubic hair as a morally relevant trait, and it is nonsensical. Like what you could, it's not focusing on what is actually sensical in terms of moral questions, and so it just goes into bizarre territory. Or you could just name any trait you want. You could name like molecular makeup, physical location, and history, and all these things, and you could just throw traits at it which will just break the argument down, and it's just opening itself up to handle any trait, and it's doing so at its peril, because it just becomes incoherent at that point. And for lay people who don't really understand it, why can't just use marginal cases?
Wait. Why would that make it incoherent? Someone can certainly say it's the exact makeup of the atoms, but what that means is that like you have this like knowledge of the exact set of atoms in every human that you see, and that that doesn't have value.
But that's an epistemic problem. That's not a metaphysic problem.
No,
and you could also claim moral revelation. Like you could say you're a particularist, and like the individual in World 3 is not invoking a moral revelation with me. Like if we wanted to go into like if we're willing to break it down into the point of there's epistemic problems, like we could just reject like a systemic view of morality, especially as a non-cognitivist entering this discussion. It means the fact that like most of the people you're debating are subjectivists regardless. Like these people are arguing that it's based on their attitudes, and they're coming up to it with like I don't think an animal is morally valuable, but I do think a human is morally valuable. That's like the atypical person that you kind of meet.
Yeah, but just to be clear before we move too deep into this, are we all in agreement that it doesn't make it incoherent, the fact that people can name traits? Like that's the point of the argument. The fact that
people can name traits? No.
Yeah, because this fact that like people could name whatever trait they want, that's purposeful.
But if some traits can make it incoherent.
That's what I'm arguing for. Not all traits, obviously. If you just name intelligence, and you're basically doing something similar to marginal cases. But the thing is, marginal cases focuses on abilities, or at least my interpretation of it that I've seen in many vanilla versions of marginal case arguments focus on morally relevant abilities. Because the thing is, if you just take someone who is severely mentally retarded or disabled, then they literally don't have any abilities that they can really do. So or none that an animal can't do at that point. And so then it really is okay, what are you actually on about here? What is the morally relevant ability? But if you can name sort of the amount of freckles, or you can name some just nonsensical arbitrary bullshit, or the molecular makeup, or the as I say, like more technical things, it just becomes it draws away from what we are trying to do as vegan activists.
I don't think so.
No, because that's the point.
That's the whole point. Yeah, it points out how stupid that argument is.
Yeah,
you equalize the trait with a human.
You could say molecular makeup and all this sort of shit, and you could just say, okay, well, now I've named the trait as molecular makeup. We now have two objects which share the same molecular makeup in the same place, and in the thought experiment, it's literally the same objects at that point. And now you're saying, what's the difference between one object? Well, there's only one object there, and then
I'm absolutely with Foot Soldier in this. I'm absolutely with Foot Soldier.
That's my disagreement.
you see, if we don't name something which is morally relevant, like for example, Shadow's a descriptivist, right? So he doesn't even necessarily prescribe anything upon himself. So he literally just assumed that everyone values what they value, right? But like that's not what this argument does. It allows the construction of what Ask Yourself called the base axiom in the first place. Now, if we say that you cannot choose, like let's say you cannot choose your attitudes. And that is the foundation. Like there must be like some sort of meta-ethical foundation for this. Or if we were to say that there are only certain morally relevant traits, like that's what I'm like. Then we're not going to have that much of a problem.
I think the problem is if you start saying that what people are naming as traits are not morally relevant traits, that's just to contend that there's no like value property there, but that just seems perspectival. I think that the idea is that there's this like interpretation of it that I think that's a little bit uncharitable going on here, where what you're saying is like if they name like the number of freckles, to some people that could be a morally relevant trait, and then the response of the vegan is maybe to a degree, but overall it doesn't seem like the number of freckles would justify us killing someone. So you can have a morally relevant, like a moral relevance to freckles, but overall that sentience pro toto is going to override that.
I would make the argument that if we were to say that there was a moral relevance, then the conclusion that you must value an animal could follow, right? That like then we could say that then you can only come up with a contradiction. I think that if we were to say that there were only certain traits that were morally relevant, you might be able to force a contradiction there. On the other hand, if we were to say that anything can be morally relevant, then we can just break name the trait, and the contradiction does not necessarily have to follow.
Well, I don't think it breaks name the trait. I think that all it does is mean that what you're saying is that someone can reject P2 by naming a trait.
No.
That's not what I'm saying.
I would like to just get onto my like disagreement with P1. It's not a disagreement with P2.
Yeah, because just to be clear, like there's this difference between naming a trait that's bad, like it's just like if you name like having red hair, like clearly that's something that most people wouldn't think is even mattering to morality, but if someone names it, you can just say like that's absurd, and then you can give an argument for why it's absurd. But what's more interesting, I think, is that Shadow thinks that there are certain traits that simply cannot be equalized, and so contradiction is like completely undiscoverable. And so I'm interested in like what that would entail, and what we would say to get to there.
Yeah, I think that's where we're probably like before we get Shadow in like the explainer. I think that's pretty much like what me and Shadow were doing with what video in the first place. We're arguing that there are only like certain traits. We're not saying like all traits couldn't be equalized, like but like rather that certain traits like force an incoherence.
Sure.
And then we made the point that if it isn't incoherent, then the conclusion doesn't necessarily follow. So like if you were to say that you could trait equalize, these traits couldn't there are some traits that couldn't be equalized, then we'll be saying that we could reject P2 and we aren't forced into the conclusion. So the argument wouldn't necessarily be sound. So either the argument is incoherent, premise one is incoherent, or the argument is not necessarily sound. That was our point.
Sure, I'm down to listen to why we should reject P1, but I'd require like an argument for that.
Yeah, sure. So let me just start into that. So if we take the given human and the given animal at the start of this trait equalization process as two distinct ontological beings, they have their own substance that they're made out of, and I'm giving an evaluation to that. So I'm just going to just skip the whole nominal sense of identity, and we're just going to take a metaphysical sense of it. And I say, well, as long as we're talking about this set of atoms, as long as, you change it any which way, I'm going to continue to value it. And you can add some stuff and you can subtract some stuff. Okay, sure, fine. But, if we're talking about that other set of atoms, I don't value them, care about it. This set of atoms, I do. Right? And then you start saying, well, I change it in this way, I change it in that way. And in senses, it becomes like the other one. What I'm saying is that to say that it's equalized in the sense of what it's made out of, like those particular set of atoms, we have to either say that they both are made out of the same original atoms, which is just impossible because we already just at the beginning said they were distinct.
But they can be distinct nominally, right? So like objecthood, A-hood and B-hood
if you say,
can just be names, right?
If you say given human and given animal at the start is specifically nominal, right? if you said that was specifically nominal, but otherwise it was the same, I think I could understand what you mean, but I don't think anyone would ever take it to be the case that that's what you were talking about.
And regardless, if you were to make it like purely nominal and not relate to like a metaphysical or an ontological like trait like that actually exists, then like the way I see it is that we could literally in place of animal and a given human and a given animal just use logical quantifiers.
Sure, we could. But I think that I'm not willing to accept that most people wouldn't accept the nominal understanding, because what you're saying with like the trait equalization process operating in a way that derives the same object with two different nominal referrers is just to say that once we end up at the end of the trait equalization process, it's like having like a water bottle in front of you and saying like this water bottle is both a good water bottle and a bad.
No,
water
I know
bottle,
that what the point is. I know what it's trying to do.
Right, and so I don't see why people wouldn't accept that.
But if you agree that the given human and the given animal have separate ontologies at the start of it, then I don't see how you're getting to a purely nominal view of identity by the end of it.
And there's also a point to be made of whether the ontology of the being is what forces the relevance, or is it the
I don't care about the relevance. Like,
well, no,
I'm arguing against the relevant trait.
I don't care
about.
Yeah, look, guys. We seem to be. We seem to be asking a lot of questions about what is this, what happens with that, what is the trait equalization process here, how can we visualize this trait, how can we do that? Can we just get a supporting argument for P1 of name the trait so we know what the trait equalization process actually is?
Yeah. If it's the case that you have two sets with identical properties, and it is the case that you confer different moral judgments for these sets, then it is the case that you are operating on pain of contradiction, so on and so forth. Like it's a pretty trivial claim. I don't think anyone's contending that P1 is something that entails.
If it's a
but your idea of a set is a nominal label.
Yeah, if it's a nominal,
nobody takes it to be.
I mean, that's the thing. If it's purely nominal, then I like the number 7, man. I really like the number 7, and maybe number 6 isn't doing it for us. And
that's also possible, even though that's even more stupid than the one that I was claiming people could pick. But I still think
that's
it's possible.
That's the thing. If we're going to hold that there is no morally irrelevant traits, then why not? It's not necessarily this is the kind of the problem. If I feel the argument for marginal cases doesn't fall into this pit hole.
The
Shadow said he'll be right back in a minute. So.
Yeah, the thing is if what you're saying now is that someone could just hold value with the nominal characteristics, I'm fine with that, because in a sense that still retains P1 under the understanding of what we're talking about. Like, it's still the case that you do and do not confer value on this set, but it's the it's a nominal difference. It's the nominal difference that causes that. So it's actually while P1 is going to be true, you're rejecting P2 and you're referring to the nominal characteristics.
The question, the real question is how can it be a given human and a given animal whilst being purely nominal? What we are doing then is using given human and given animal can represent anything. If this was true, if this is how we're using it, then name the trait could argue moral valuation of anything.
Yeah.
Anything at all. Valuing plants, valuing rocks, valuing the specific atoms. Then it is moot. It holds no relevance to the moral valuation of an animal.
No, you could do that, but the problem is that the thing that people can do is just reject P2 with respect to rocks, because there is no trait that is true of rocks. That means that if we turned a human into a rock, we would give it moral value.
I don't think anything's turning into that sort of language. When you talk about turning into, you have taken away any ontological sense of turning into things. So you're not talking about actually taking atoms and rearranging them. No,
of course.
They were already the same. They just
this sounds like an equivocation on what trait equalization actually is. Is it a metamorphosis, or is it the iterative
I just want to know, Brent, from your perspective, do you start with two ontologies? It's like given human and given animal, two separate things, two separate objects.
Yeah, so we can start with two separate objects, and then I think even if we end up with one object, there's no problem with that, because
Well, that's something that I wanna get right into, because this is the point. Like, I think that moral value, especially when Ask Yourself was debating rationality rules, he was arguing specifically that it must be related to ontology. Now, if name the trait is purely nominal, then I really feel that it's
No,
it's
no,
a
no,
really
no.
terrible argument. But if it's related to ontology, then it's related to the actual traits, the actual
Yeah.
properties of an object, and
But
then
that's-
that equalization
but
is
that's-
what could force
but
like
that's-
incoherence.
But that's my point, is that there's just a nominal referrer. It's not the case that the argument itself is nominal. Now, you could say that someone could come along and say, well, it's actually the nominal characteristics that matter. But I think
that's not
Like,
my
we-
problem. Like,
yeah,
I want you to
nobody's
actually address my criticism before we finish this.
I need to
Yeah.
quickly clear that.
yeah. So like again, just lay out your criticism, and we'll go through it while everyone else is at the washroom or whatnot.
Okay. So we have two separate ontologies. One's made out of one stuff, the other one's made out of the other. We agree that this is, in fact, the start of Name the Trade. At the end of it, if I say I value one of the ontologies, I'm not talking about a nominal label for it. I'm just talking specifically that set of atoms or whatever, right?
Yep.
What happens to both sets at the end of it? One of them would just have to be deleted.
Yeah, that's fine. I think that it's not deleted more as it is that what the sets are referring to is just the same object, and I think that's fine.
Just saying I'm grabbing the nominal label and I'm pushing it over to something else. But if what I valued was the concept that it represents, the referent of the label, then we haven't actually fixed the problem.
That's fine. You can. The point is if what you value is this specific makeup of atoms, at the end of the argument, like, you're going to value the two things the same way. That's all that would mean, right?
What do you mean by two things?
I mean two nominal referrers, and so it's the same. It's the same referent, right? There's only one referent at the end.
But there was two referents at the start. I want to know what happens to one of the referents.
It literally just doesn't matter. Like the point is that.
Yeah, 100% mad. This has been my entire contention. You can't just tell me it doesn't matter when it's my whole.
No, because we're making like a comparative evaluation between. So like in the case of Name the Trait, what we're saying is you compare the human that exists in the actual world, and you compare it to whatever world we're talking about right now. And so if at the end of it, what the final world is it loops back around to comparing back to the original world, and you're just comparing the human to itself.
I've already said I don't have. Yeah, if you're saying you're comparing it to the human, but that's not what the claim is. It says it's equalized to the given animal, and if we agree the animal had an ontology, how did it equal that?
Well, yeah, like nobody here is rejecting that if A was B, if we value A, and that if A was B, we would value B. But what we're saying is that A is not B.
I want to go on into this because what you're saying, Bryn, is that we're comparing the finalized human with the starter human, right? If we're saying that it's still the same ontology as the starter human, then I can say that I still value it without being in contradiction with my first statement, which was the fact that I didn't value a different ontology, which we just stopped talking about for some reason.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's fine. I think that, so what you're saying is like you value like some kind of like substance to this ontology, and you could certainly say that. The problem is I think it's just being slightly uncharitable to what the argument's doing. Because I'm
only fighting the wording of we've already agreed. Very little at stake here. But I don't think. How are you saying that if you're claiming that contradiction is forced, then you can't just wave away my criticism?
Well, because I think that your criticism is being uncharitable to like what we're saying in premise one. Because there isn't a requirement to retain that like original ontology throughout the entire argument. The point is there is for contradiction. The point is and when we're iterating, we have like one ontology that we're referring to in every iteration, and so whether or not we're moving from human to animal or animal to human, just sort of regardless. The point is that you're comparing that first real world ontology to some new iterative ontology the next time and then the next time and the next time and the next time, it's never the case that we even only had like the two ontologies when we were going through the iterative process. We're talking about either some like fictional ontology
I've
or
addressed,
whatever, right?
Yeah, but I've addressed that particular criticism by saying that moral retainment as a concept just doesn't work anymore. Because if somebody says my value was the ontology, you never kept it.
Well, this is the point. Like this is the kind of the point I want to kind of get into, right? Like so, like let's make it like a specific example, especially because we want to try and keep the audience here and like maybe them not scratch their own eyes out. So, like I guess like what I want to try and make this is like as you know as approachable as possible. So like what I want to know is from name the trait in this is with it saying that you know there is a contradiction if you believe that trait equalizable, but then you know Shadow's traits were you know what he brought up in the vegan gains debate, and like I would say that he didn't lead to an absurd position, okay, but he didn't necessarily value animals.
Let's talk about that now.
Well, the reason
resolve P1.
Yeah,
I know,
so,
but this is the reason I was just trying to bring this up is because what I'm trying to say is that if we were to say that it is, if we were to say that there's an ontological difference, is it that we must value, like, must we always come out not valuing an animal if we believe that there is an ontological value of humans if we enter P1? No.
I think that the point is that there's two options for the Carnist to take in this, and that one of them is to either name a trait, and you could certainly say that the ontology is a trait, or alternatively that they're operating like contradictorily, and either of those are going to be problematic for them. The first one, like saying that it's like you know some specific trait, the vegan has to substantiate why that's a problem via some other argument. But just saying it's like the ontology is the trait, I don't see how that derives a problem in terms of like the overall coherence of the argument, except for maybe with respect to what Shadow Starshine is saying, which is that there's no contradiction at this point. But I think that there is a contradiction, because if it's the case that we're talking about the ontology, then, and you haven't named the ontology as the trait, then it's the case that like at the end of it, like the ontology is the same, but you don't value it the same.
But is it not disingenuous to say the word trait? Say that it is anything true of a given like human and animal, right? Like, and then say that you would have to name the ontology. Like if someone names like the human, they don't mean the word. They don't mean nominally humanity. They mean the actual physical form of a human. They mean something that exists.
Right. And so the idea is that if you were to say that it, like this is where the contradiction comes from, right? Is if you get to the point where it's the ontological, like instantiation of the human, and then you have the exact same instantiation as a comparator, it would be nonsensical to say that those things have different value.
But you know it's not the same. There's the same in the which atoms would move towards it, right? Like there's still the distinction that's just being glossed over.
Yeah, like this is the thing. Like we can either say they are the same or they aren't the same, and if they are the same, there's a contradiction. If they aren't the same, then it doesn't necessarily have to follow. Do you see what I mean? Like.
But they are the same. At some point in the trait equalization process, it is the case.
So
it's the exact same atom.
You'd have to say that, like, yeah, you'd have to say. But in which case, then we have to say that we never had two objects, man.
No, because that's at that point. Then what you're doing is confusing things true in the hypothetical and true outside of the hypothetical.
I don't even care about that distinction. Whether or not I agree that distinction even exists doesn't mean that distinction matters.
The point is like if we're talking about possible worlds, there is just going to be some possible world that we're talking about, and we're comparing between those possible worlds.
Well, this is the thing. Well, what if like for example, like if we were to
none
say
of this gets to my problem.
Like
none of this solves what happens to these two separate ontologies.
Well, I think
you just say they are the same.
I think that's going back to the nominal case, right? That you are now nominally saying they're the same. They're not actually the same. Like if they were entirely indiscernible, then we would say that there is the same object existing in two separate universes. right? And as was said, Lewis rejects that. Like you argued for David Lewis. Lewis absolutely rejects that. He said that.
I don't argue for Lewis.
Right. Okay. Well, I thought you did just because you.
No, I was using Lewisian terms.
Right. Sorry. My mistake.
Yeah. I myself am a fictionalist, and so I think that when I think about it, we're talking about these like fictional worlds, right? We're not talking about.
You wouldn't make mortal realism at all, like.
No, we're not talking about like a literal like multi-universe where there is,
No, but it's not about literal. Like, would say that like it is possible. Like, would say that like the whole point of it being mortal is that it would be necessarily possible. Well, what I'm saying is that it would be that this is impossible. Like, this is something that it would, for it to be the same thing, it could not exist in another possible world. You see, that's Lewis's point, isn't it?
And I've actually, earlier in this debate, I conceded that I think that there is actually some weirdness here when we get into like the possible world interpretation. And so I think that there is like a sense in which you could say, yes, all of the properties of this object are the same as all the properties of this object in this other, like, even fictional universe. But that overall, like, what you're saying is that you could think about those things separately for whatever reason, because it is separate, possible worlds. That's fine. I think that that's where now I'm more open to thinking about this just in terms of like sets of properties and whether those properties like how those properties ground our moral evaluations. And if that's the view that we have, then I think that
then we need to remove the name. Like then what I would say is that we shouldn't say equalizable to a given human. What we need to do is remove a given human from this and a given animal, because then what we've done is we've gave that an ontological instantiation in which it refers to a given being, and that's what's causing like the problem.
I think we both sort of realize, or at least I think we finally are at the heart of the problem here. I don't think that name the trait is literally like committing itself. There's a sort of this flipping between the metamorphoses and the possible world interpretation. Really, all we're talking about is like, look, like if we're iterating through these traits, like some of these things have value and some of these things don't. We're not quite literally doing that. There's no point where we quite literally delete the original animal, etc. It's more just like, look, if there were the case that there were this thing in the world, or if we're talking about a set of properties that does have these traits, then it's the case that this thing has moral value, this thing doesn't have moral value. I think that's
then we'll have to implement the idea that it would be morally relevant, and then it would not. Then you couldn't say that people would always be in contradiction unless they would you would say that there was like this is the whole point of like the argument.
What's morally relevant.
We'd be back at marginal cases. That's where
but I've already agreed to that. I think that all that name the trait is doing is either showing that you are acting contradictorily, but which is fine, or what they can do is reject P2. And all that.
No. I disagree that this is a rejection of P2 in any sort of way. I need to show that you actually forced contradiction, and I need a description that handles two separate ontologies. Somebody saying they value an ontology, and then actually seeing them equalized.
Yeah, I think that all. So, if what we're saying is we care about this specific ontology, that's fine. Like that just means that they would be naming that as the trait, and there's no point. There's no point at which it gets deleted. I don't see what the problem is there.
The problem is that if it
not
doesn't
naming a trait, because somebody doesn't have to value that trait, I can just bring this trait up as a way to show you that contradiction is enforced. I don't actually have to say I hold it to value.
History is an important trait. Try it with history. What happens? We delete the history of the other animal.
History is just a sense of the ontology, right? Like it's a way of describing that this atom used to be around in this location and it was doing these sorts of things, and now it's over here, right? Like this is the whole sense.
Yeah, but look, if we say it's the history of being a
it's doing those things fictionally, right? It's not actually doing those things.
But it doesn't matter. It doesn't
it's
matter.
A hypothetical.
Yeah, but it doesn't matter.
Addressing it.
Yeah, but
how do you hypothetically do it? I don't care if it's real or not.
Like just to bring it back to modal logic, even if this is acting as you say in modal logic, like it must be. It necessarily has to be possible for this to function in modal logic.
Sure.
So if it's impossible, then it couldn't even be input in modal logic, in which case it would be incoherent.
Well, I don't think it is impossible. Like that's the thing is the argument itself is not not like a modal argument. Like it's never the case that you could literally compare you could literally compare like something to itself as a separate thing that isn't itself or whatever. Like we can say that that's fine. The point to state is that all that the world's interpretation is showing is that we're just talking about this hypothetically. So, like, I don't see how this is a problem.
Well, the problem is that if it's either an ontological
contradiction, waive my issue. Like, I agree, it's hypothetical. I'm already agreeing with you, but that doesn't solve my problem.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense in the hypothetical. That's the problem, right? Let's say it's your mum. Is like the history is that it's your mum. I asked you, Bryn, at the end, just before you had to go the day before yesterday, and I said, what happens if we trait equalize a pig, your mum with a pig? And you said, oh, well, you're going to have some sort of pig mum, or the pig would be your mum. And I just don't really understand this, because if you trait equalized all traits, you've trait equalized the history of the pig not being your mum as well, so it's no longer your mum anymore. And it's just incoherent to think of a pig that's had all of its history switched out. So the entire history of that pig is being a pig, and I've trait equalized that. So I've now got my mum. I've swapped the history of my mum. All mumness is gone, and now it's just pigness. But that is still my mum. That is the bit that I'm struggling with, and it just sounds incoherent to me.
Yeah, well, it's only incoherent because you haven't followed at all. Like what you just said is that it's the case that it's my mom and it isn't my mom.
Exactly, so it's incoherent.
But that's only because you've made it incoherent. The argument itself
that's literally what it's doing.
No, the argument itself isn't incoherent. You're the one who's
the hypothetical is forcing me to do.
It doesn't do that. When you equalize the history isn't itself just a singular trait. There's a lot of other traits there. And the point is that if what you're saying now is that it has the trait of being my mom and it has the trait of not being my mom, that's just entirely on you. You've not.
But is it like the thing is that what he's saying if it's ontologically the same, then it's his mom, right? And then his mom exists in two places simultaneously, and these are identical, right? In which case it hasn't been equalized. Well, on the other hand,
then we're just equivocating of an identity, right?
That's the whole point.
I mean, no, this is fine if you want to say that foot soldier's wrong, or this person's wrong, or that person's wrong, and everybody's wrong. I just want a description that actually handles the ontologies. That's all I want.
Yeah.
I couldn't think of one. I tried every possibility, and I'm not coming up with one.
Can we just go back to basics here? Can I go back to basics for a minute and just spend a couple of seconds getting this on a piece of paper? I want to get my head straight on P1, right? So let's just take the antecedent of P1. Is a given human within the set of human? Bryn?
Sure.
Yeah, it is. So if it's possible for a given human, it must be possible for it must be possible within the set of human, right? We agree on that, because that's uncontroversial, right?
Yeah.
So I can delete given here. So now we've deleted given there, and I'm assuming it's the same for non-human as well.
I'll give what's happening now.
Yeah, all given there is just acting as a reference to the thing we were talking before the argument was on.
And
that's confusing me. Let's take out given. It's confusing me. Given is gone. If your view affirms a human is trait equalizable to...
less confusing for you and just go to the dialogue tree? Like, it's in simple English. Maybe it'll be easier for you there.
I don't care about the dialogue tree. I want
to look at the argument. I want to look at the argument, right? So I don't understand what trait equalizable is. Does that mean can be the same as?
Yeah.
But is it likeness? Is it likeness or is it identical?
Is it the same or identical?
It can be identical.
It can be identical. Okay. It can be identical to. So now we are removing trait equalization, trait equalizable, and we're putting in can be identical to. If your view affirms a human can be identical to a non-human animal, that doesn't make any fucking sense.
Well, no, you can say that, but then you can't say that contradiction was forced.
No, it just doesn't make any sense, because my view can't affirm that a human can be identical to a non-human animal. animal.
Yeah,
So it's
yeah,
saying
yeah,
that my view can affirm that A is B and not A is B and A at the same time.
So again, human and non-human are just nominal.
But then
There's
if it's nominal, we've already talked about this. If it's nominal, then we can literally prove anything with this. All we're saying is A. If A is B, then A. But then it's useless, Bryn.
It's
useless.
Hold on. It's not just nominal because you said there was two ontologies.
Yeah, you
said there
did
was
say
two
a given
ontologies.
human and a given animal.
No.
Okay, so
if
what
I'm
I'm going to do now here, guys, I'm just going to read this one last time, and then I'm going to just like step down. I'll sit here, but I'll step down from the conversation, right? So I'm just going to read this one last time, just to voice where I'm at with name the trait. So we've now reduced P1 down to something which makes sense to me, and that is if your view affirms a human can be identical to a non-human animal, then blah. That makes sense to me. That is fucking bullshit. And
Okay,
now
no,
I'm out of the conversation.
Foot soldier, before you go, let me make this even. So you're attempting to be charitable, I hope. So let me make it even more charitable and say that really what the argument is saying is that if it is the case that object A can be identical to an object B, then your view can only deny that the given object A has moral value distinct from object B on pain of a contradiction. That's all that's saying.
But that rejects modal logic. It would be rejecting like the law of necessitation. Like
sure, it rejects logic. It's cool, man.
No,
it's agnostic to logic. It's agnostic.
No. 1 moment. Without Shadow Starshine or perspective philosophy talking, can you please replicate what perspective philosophy just said, Foot Soldier? You just tried to tell me that I was rejecting logic. I would like you to replicate perspective philosophy's criticism without perspective philosophy helping you. So right now, face your green screen so he can't type anything out to you, and just tell me what he just said. Replicate his argument for me. Explain to me what perspective philosophy just said. Because
all I caught was that would reject modal logic.
Right, and why do you think that? So turn to your green screen and explain to me why it would reject modal logic, because right now you're just parroting perspective philosophy. You have no fucking clue what you're talking about.
Well, you're just asserting that I have no clue what I'm talking about, right?
So turn to your green screen and explain to me.
I don't need to turn around to a green screen or anything. Like, right. I just read what I boiled this down to, and you agree. If your view affirms a human can be identical to a non-human animal, to me, that is breaking the Aristotelian law of identity, right? That is rejecting logic, right? That is rejecting logic.
Replicate his fucking argument instead of taking cheap shots.
Well, hold on.
What I heard was
let's keep it civil.
That rejects logic, right?
He's the one who, I mean, this is the problem though, right? The break in civility came from the other side. It's not coming from me. I'm asking him to replicate.
What you want about it?
He was taking cheap shots. He was taking cheap shots.
I'm wrong here.
He was taking cheap shots. He doesn't even understand what perspective philosophy is saying.
Let me talk.
Yeah, I mean, I'll agree with
Let me
you.
talk.
Probably Foot Soldier doesn't know modal logic, and I barely know modal logic. But didn't you also agree that it broke modal logic? Didn't you say that?
I would like Foot Soldier.
Yeah, why did you just dodge my question? Didn't you affirm that it did?
We can get into whether it breaks the law of necessitation.
No, I'm asking. Did you just previously say yes? It okay.
No, it didn't. No,
I thought you said yes.
He actually said sure. I remember him saying sure.
No, I didn't. And then the problem is I don't think that Foot Soldier can replicate the arguments that he is using as pot shots.
No, he probably.
This is going to remain civil. Instead of taking pot shots, what we should allow is for someone like perspective philosophy to actually deliver the argument.
Can I speak for myself instead of speaking for me?
Right. Go ahead.
Without you talking over me. Okay, so all I heard there, I heard a bit of a jumbled mess, right? And I just heard him say, so it rejects logic, right? Or something like rejects modal logic. I don't really know about modal logic. I just think that this rejects the law of identity in the Aristotelian sense, because it's saying if your view affirms A can be identical to B, right? But now you're going to compare A when it's now A is the same as B. That is just the Aristotelian classic sense of breaking the law of identity. That's rejecting logic. So
Sure,
when
can I
I
get an argument
heard
for that?
perspective philosophy say something
can I just
shit
give an
like
argument for why that would-
logic, which I don't really
Right.
understand, I was just
Right.
like, yeah, so it's agnostic to logic because it literally says a human can be identical to a non-human animal. And sorry if I don't know modal logic or whatever. I don't know enough about this technical.
So
PhD
before,
English.
so before,
That
so before we,
is
so before we let
classical
your,
logic.
before we let your Aristotelian point go away, let's remember that the real understanding was, if object A is identical to object B, then it is the case that saying that these things have different moral judgments would be on a plane of contradiction. So could you explain to me why that statement would cause a break in the Aristotelian sense of logic? I just require an argument for that. Go ahead.
Well, you're saying that something can be something which is not itself.
Well, A is identical to B, actually. They're
No,
just
no, no,
different,
no.
they're just different names.
No. Wait, wait.
So like for example,
we have human and non-human. So we have P and not P can be P can be identical to not P.
Yeah, I was
Human
no,
is P,
no,
non-human
no,
is not P.
guys,
So P
guys,
can be
guys,
identical
guys,
to not P.
guys.
No, because
Guys,
now
can I,
you're being
like
now you're
rather
being
than
charitable
rather
to
than
what it's saying,
rather
right?
than
Because
like confuse it like this, why don't we, if we're gonna use the Aristotelian laws of identity and so on, why don't we, like, just for the sake of it, since you're saying it's nominal anyway, right? Like, so like if we wanted to just break it into like the just a priori analytic, we'll keep it there, change it from non-human animal to an animal. Right now, if what it be like really what if it was nominal, we could literally just go A and B, right? So if A is B,
but that's what I've been saying all along.
Yeah,
right?
exactly, right.
That's what I'm saying. It's
which-
like think about Clark Kent and Superman, right? Like the idea is we
Yeah,
could
sure,
say
water H2O.
Yeah, like water-
It's
like-
synthetic.
right, exactly. Well, whether or not we accept the synthetic distinction, I think is a discussion.
Oh,
we should have
good,
another.
sure.
We should have another.
I don't want to dive down every rabbit. here.
But yeah, the point just is that all that Ask Yourself and I mean by it being a nominal distinction is that at the end of it, when you're saying that this is a pig and this is a human, those are just names that you gave those things. They no longer have the traits of humanity and the traits of pigness.
No, you see,
I
I
don't
disagree. I
say this.
disagree. Like the whole point
No.
is that if it was nominal, then you need to make sure that it is nominal, and like I expressly say that. And I think that it's somewhat, if it's purely nominal, then I have no necessarily problems with it. But then I just do not think that it can force that you are contradicting yourself with moral value, because I mean.
But that's what it would then mean, I think, unless we want to get deeper into Shadow Starshine's contention. All that really means is that people are just naming traits.
Yeah,
and I'm
also
fine with that.
yeah,
But
and
yeah,
also
but
then it
that's
would also
my-
mean that
I'm not agreeing that my contention is naming traits.
Yeah,
my,
yeah.
my
see.
contention is this trait didn't get dealt with. That's my trait. It didn't get equalized.
Right.
You're saying it did, but it didn't.
Right, and I want to get deeper into that idea because I think that that's maybe interesting, and I think that the problem is I think there's some kind of language game going on here because for me it seems to just make perfect sense that if what we're talking about is just something named A and something named B, those things can have separate ontologies at the beginning of the trait equalization process and in the actual world. But that when we iterate through our hypothetical worlds, we're talking about things that have like no ontology at all, or just separate ontologies, or alternatively, by the time that we get to the end of the argument, it
Can I
is
say
just
that I
it
hate
is-
that you're also saying or as if you don't know because none of us know Ask Yourself's actual position. Like you're saying it could be this or it could be that.
It's not that I don't have a good idea of what Ask Yourself is saying. It's more just that I'm trying to be as open to like all of the ways that we could interpret it, as well as like or Ask Yourself to come and defend it later if he wants.
No, I
to.
mean,
like,
I'm
yeah,
open
yeah.
to anything that works.
The point is I think and I think most like Wittgensteinians like Dave would agree here is that really and we've agreed that
he doesn't want his name in here. I know that.
we don't have to drag him in here. But the point is I think that we sort of all agree that what's going on here is not a problem with the essence of the argument. And we from the very beginning, you and I have agreed that at most what is at stake here is just a language. It's just, yeah, right. And I'm totally fine with that idea. I think that really like one of these days, like we should get like the big brains, like Dave, Ask Yourself, like maybe even get like Malpass or someone in there into like a call and figure out like if there is some way in which the language could be better constructed. The only sort of contention.
Why is Ask Yourself the big brain?
Yeah, and can we not compare Dave, who I think, and I'd like to congratulate him because I think he's just got published.
He did,
Stop talking about Dave. He doesn't want to be talked about. I know this much about him.
Well,
is that he's going to hate the fact that anyone said his name.
I'm trying to talk about Dave because I really want him to just like read
Name
Eastern
for
philosophy. Yeah, read. I'm very jealous that you guys got like a reading of Eastern philosophy as you fell asleep last night. I wish I could have gotten that. But the point is just that there seems to be a sense in which the wording is being objected to, and I think that that's just like some kind of like language game, and I have no problem with that.
Of course, objecting to wording is a language.
Well, this is the issue, right? So I was saying that if name the trait is purely nominal, like this is the point. If we say it's purely nominal, there's no problems. I don't think any of us have a problem with it being like absolutely nominal. But if it's absolutely nominal, then the conclusion does not necessarily follow. Like, because then we can't force someone to say like, if what is it like? If we're to say like if A is B, then like, and if you morally value A, like yeah, fair enough, but that absolutely doesn't relate to metaphysically anything. Like we might as well have wrote out like the pure logical form of this. And I don't think anyone is necessarily saying that the pure like logical identifiers are what are causing the problem. What's causing the problem is the meaning of the words and the coherency of the premise. As soon as those words actually entail a truth value in relation to an ontological being, and once we have that being the case, then I think Shadow's argument really does just it takes out P1, and that's where we need to do. So I mean, if we say that, I think we'll all accept, like if we were to say if A was B, then if A was B, then we would value A, then we would value B.
Just before, so we can get clear before we go too far down that pathway. I think that the reason why, like I'm here defending it, why Ask Yourself is defending it, is the way in which certain people have like published their views on this seem to imply that like name the trait as a concept should be thrown out, and I think that that's sort of very dangerous because we at least it seems like we agree that there's something being done here that's useful, and that really like.
Well, I do. I don't know about.
Right.
Yeah,
right,
I'm not
right,
sure if there's anything useful in name and trait that's better than marginal cases or something like that.
Yeah, but that doesn't like. I think
better.
like remember Foot Soldier that he's not saying that useful is in general.
Into the wording. I want to finish it.
Yeah, but like the thing is I think that if it were the case that if you could just open up Peter Singer's animal equality essay, so you just read like the first like 10 pages of animal liberation to people, and that would work better than running name the trait, that there wouldn't be people running name the trait. I think that the fact that name the trait is used not only just by people on Discord but also by people in like Anonymous for the Voiceless and like other street epistemologists, people like Vegan Games have used it successfully. I think that the fact that has occurred is evidence against the position that it's so confusing or doesn't derive something more than the AMC does.
Well, there's an equivocation.
There's
a huge equivocation. That's why, because people are just not understanding the formulation of name and trait. So they're understanding the general concept of marginal cases. So they've been using that. So Ask Yourself's been popularizing marginal cases, which is great, but adding this layer of confusion. And I have spoken in private to various different activists who are actually like known, like the activists that people watch on YouTube, and none of these guys actually fucking know what's going on with trait equalization and parallel worlds and whether it's a metamorphosization or all this. None of them care or know.
I think I'll say this. Like,
starts with P1 if a given human is trait equalizable to a given. Nobody does that, right? They all start at the conversation.
And I mean,
but I've had this conversation with you guys before that really what people are running, and the thing that like the Ask Yourself debate Discord teaches people to do is run the dialogue tree. And the dialogue tree is like on your current moral view, if all traits true of a human who we think has moral value are switched to match those of true of a given like animal who doesn't have moral value. So it doesn't operate.
And nobody understands that question
But you see-
generally.
you see-
Well,
Yeah,
well,
I would,
but
like,
that's where I
if
would
may,
push.
like, if
That's
I
where I
may,
would
guys.
push back. That's where I would push back.
If they hear
because-
that and they go, "What?" and then somebody says, "What's the difference between human and animals?" and they're like, "Oh, I see what you're trying to say."
Yeah, but I don't think that that's really true either. I mean, at this point now, we've gone past like we seem to agree that the essence of what the argument is doing is good. We agree that the argument is at least valid in its current formulation, and that maybe the soundness of P1 is questionable based on certain interpretations.
I don't agree.
But
I don't agree that I think the essence of the argument is good. I think the
you
essence of the argument.
But you just said the essence of the argument is the argument for marginal cases. So do you think?
No. I
think
think people. No. Let me clarify if I was unclear there. I think people don't understand name the trait. But they do understand marginal. Or they do understand spot the difference or something. So they just
Right.
they fall back on spot the difference. And there's nothing wrong with saying what's the fucking difference. Like
But
that's
that's-
just like
what's
that's
the
saying
mer-
what's the difference.
I mean,
That-
really,
that
what
is
was
But the
reason-
essence of the argument of name the trait is a trait equalization process and name it any trait that you can possibly imagine. And I don't think that's useful at all. As I said earlier in this live debate and as we were talking about in private, I think it's much more useful for vegan advocacy to actually say what's the morally relevant ability. And
Yeah,
I've seen the
morally
word
relevant
ability
distinction.
used. And I know you're saying that Singer uses traits as well, properties as well. But in the formalization, the vanilla formalizations that I've seen, it's been more concerned with abilities. And I think abilities are a lot more interesting, morally relevant than just molecular makeup or something like.
But that's the point of the argument, right? Is to show that, for example, in the case of racism, pointing to melanin density, some people might value that. But the point is that overall sentience is the thing that matters, and so racism is a nonsensical concept.
Well, you've just confirmed my
guys,
position then, because
like, look,
pointing to
first.
melanin in the skin doesn't tell us anything. But saying, but they're sentient as well, what abilities have they got? Well, they've got the ability to suffer.
like,
They've got
look,
the ability
look,
to do
like,
everything that
that's
other
what-
humans
I
have got.
disagree there.
Betrayed
I
it.
disagree with you, foot soldier. There, like, if I'm honest, right? Look at it like this, right? I'm not agreeing with name the trait either. I'm just saying that Peter Singer says that that only human beings deserve. Like the first premise is that only in order to conclude that all and only human beings deserve a full and equal moral status. And what we mean by moral status typically means an intrinsic property within the being, and that there would be a property that was lacking within the animal. And so what we'll talk about is a property and not something that is true of. Now, I think that's the point. Like, it inherently relates to ontology. Now, if it inherently relates to ontology, his argument has no problems. If it inherently relates to ontology with name the trait, I would say that there was a problem. But if it says that there's only, then it allows for, like, let's say, nominal differences, like things that don't relate to the actual beings themselves, or only relate to, or even like a judgment in which we make in respect to their ontology, and that is purely nominal. Then I would say name the trait works fine. Like the only thing is that it has to relate to the ontology, and that's what we need to keep this in relation to. That we are talking about trying to convince people that animals have moral value, or that they would be in contradiction if they denied the animal having moral value if they held a certain position, and not that if A was B, then if I value A, and if A was B, then I value B, or whatever it would be. That's something separate, and I don't think very many people on the street would ever reject that. Like, if you were to break it down with them, what they will reject that is that their intuition tells them that a human being has value and an animal doesn't, that there is a morally relevant distinction. That's what the argument from marginal cases is getting at. That's what the spot the difference is, and that's what name the trait kind of breaks down in doing if you run the actual argument. Do you see what I mean? That's the kind of the contentions that we have. So that's why I would be like, well, marginal cases, use marginal cases, or even just say, what is the morally relevant distinction? Like, I don't
agree with either you or Foot Soldier.
That's right. That's right.
Where were you converging, Shadow? Where were we converging?
I agree with Bryn that it brought in an iterative process where there wasn't before. Peter Singer's argument was very, like, his argument put forth as to show what he think is morally valuable. I do think name the trait has a different sort of sense in that it's more of a rhetorical question asking, like, Socratic thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but then it's making it universal. It's making, what I would say is it's making it universal rather than particular, and that's what Singer's wanted it to be particular, wanted it to be related to this world and how we understand it. Well, name the trait doesn't necessarily have to do that, and it becomes very hypothetical and
I mean,
and maybe
I feel
more
like
abstract.
name the trait is in the title.
But that's the thing. But then
Name it.
that is I will say that name the trait's name is far better. Like I definitely could see that. I love the name. Like
I think one thing getting into whole idea between like universals and particulars is that ultimately one of the benefits of name the trait is that it does allow people to say these sort of really hypothetical things or get us deep into the whole hypothetical problems. And then very clearly people will recognize that that's just sort of silly. And that at least in my anecdotal experience, the more that we've talked about, the more I've talked to people and gone through name the trait, immediately they say sort of these crazy things. We talk about the hypotheticals, and then as the conversation progresses, we talk more and more about like material reality and like what's actually going on, and we sort of start to converge on like figuring out how much does sentience matter, how much does it being a different species matter, how much does a food chain matter, stuff like that. And we start to, the point is that the iterative process, it starts by being open, I think, so as to not dissuade people, or as Shadow Starshine said, to act Socratically, but that overall that it ends up being very close to an argument for marginal cases at the end, because of course you're just running an argument for marginal cases on whatever trait they name or whatever like point of contention you get to, where you're saying either this is like an overlap, or it's the case that this is absurd, and then the vegan obviously has to argue for why it would be absurd.
Okay, but Bryn, at that point, you're just describing a what the difference scenario. So if someone says, "Oh, there's a difference between non-human animals and human animals, and that difference is a food chain, though, or something," then where does name the trait come in when you start to explain some sort of like argument against that? That's not anything to do with name the trait. That someone's asked what's the difference, and you can explain what's the difference.
Well, it is part of the conversation tree.
Yeah.
The conversation tree is for the intuition pumps over and over again.
Yeah, and I think you've got to.
But that's just what.
Like,
what's
the same
the
thing
difference?
can happen in modular cases. The exact.
Well,
same
yes.
But like again, like it's the view of Shadow Starshine and I that all you're doing is just running an argument for marginal cases over and over again Socratically, rather than sort of doing what Peter Singer is doing, which is showing you that there's a reason to value, which is
you
sentience.
see, but I completely disagree, because then if you say that what Peter Singer is definitely doing that, because what Peter Singer is using, like this is the argument for marginal cases, the use for it, and even you use it like this with name the trait, is just to start the Socratic method, man. What you do is
Agreed.
You get into the Socratic method and just like, why do you value, like if someone goes, I value, that is which is made in the image of God. Well, then that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about metaethics, and we're going to leave the normative behind, like at least to some degree, because we're going to start talking about where moral value or equal moral status is grounded, and that's where that's where we would start making positive claims, and that's where, like for example, if vegans are sentientists, we're going to have to start making positive claims if we are to conclude that all individuals should be vegan. If we were to say that they should be vegan. And that's kind of about me point in the first place. That's going to be my point of why I think, like, okay, yeah, like name the trait is an argument, but it's not an argument necessarily for the equal moral consideration of animals. It's just that you can come out of this, and this is my contention, is that you can come out of this, and even with marginal cases, you can come out of this absolutely unfazed. You can say,
Sure.
You can come out of it and go, no, there is a morally relevant difference. And with marginal cases, you'd be just rejecting one of the premises, which at least then makes it a forceful claim that you're rejecting the argument, and then we'll start the Socratic method. But I think in name the trait, I don't think you have to reject the premise. I think you can accept P1 and still come out without a contradiction. Like
Agreed.
Well, if you accept P1, you're saying, well, you'd have to reject P2. You can't reject P1 and say you come out without a contradiction.
What I mean is that, you can accept P1 and then force the argument to break down as in form of trait equalization, which is not happening within the argument for marginal cases. So then I could just then I could say but then I feel like would be better off using the argument for marginal cases, because then the ontology of the argument, the ontological application of argument for marginal cases, if it's doing the same thing, is more secure. Do you see what I mean?
I think that at this point, whether we want to get deep into like process ontology or not is
That's why I'm here.
It's sort of dubious. I don't know if I want to get into process ontology on a public live stream with chat watching, because
but
I'd want to actually.
Well, I'm sure chat's been confused for the last.
Yeah,
I don't know how.
I don't want to bore them by bringing up like Kim
we
and
can
Blue
bring
and
up
stuff like that.
We can bring up
But
nominal
I'll
modal
give you
logic,
common
but we
language.
can't bring up ontology. Like that's if we're gonna bore them with something, at least make it real.
Yeah,
I think I'm trying to talk about atoms because I think it's like at least
just
somewhat common language.
But just to summarize, because I think that instead of going like too deep down the philosophical rabbit hole, we can just.
You leaving? Is this you leaving? Are you giving an ending speech?
No, I do want to leave by like 6 or so to go hit the gym, but it's 4:30 right now, so I still got like an hour and a half. If you guys really want to go that long, I think more what I was trying to do was rope the conversation into like one specific path so we could follow it down.
Yeah.
I think that there's sort of two criticisms on the table right now. One of them is that we could continue to discuss whether or not the argument is like philosophically fully well reasoned, and I think that we sort of all just sort of agree that there might be a language game going on there, and that from that we then have to sort of diagnose how bad that language game is and whether or not other arguments have more value. Earlier in this discussion, I already pointed out that I think that name the trait needs to be run in conjunction with something that affirmatively argues for the value of sentience. And so I would point to, for example, Korsgaard's argument for animal value as an example of what you could do. And the other thing, too, is that there seemed to be this claim about the psychological impact of the argument, which, at least in my anecdotal experience, it's been the case that name the trait works pretty well. Like, most people seem to understand what's going on, even if you have to break it down like lower and lower. The dialogue tree is sort of at this point where most people run it, and people seem to get where it's going.
Well, I mean, I can bring up my criticisms of the dialogue tree too.
Yeah, you could. I think that the problem is like there seems to be this like charge. So whether or not the argument for marginal cases works better philosophically is a separate thing. There's this charge that psychologically the argument for marginal cases, as delivered simply, is better. And I think if that were the case, more people would just run like Singer's marginal case argument or Reagan's argument.
Okay, I want to know. Okay, hold on. I want to ask a question to Bryn directly. Do you agree that the people who are finding the function of name the trait useful aren't really taking into account the formal structure of it, nor a literal interpretation of the conversation tree?
Yeah, I think that that's true, but I think that this is like going to be true of pretty much any debate. Like this is the whole thing where like debates necessarily break down into natural language pretty quickly.
But then aren't we pretending? Aren't we pretending there then?
That like we're not using name the trait. I think that's the point. I don't even think we use the argument for marginal cases. People don't use the arguments. Like
no, but I think that we are using name the trait because all we're doing with name the trait is running an iterative argument.
That's what you say. But when
I say but that's what
the formal argument and the dialogue tree. Like it's similar to the dialogue tree.
Sorry, I think Richard wanted to say something.
Yeah. I can only stay here for 20 more minutes, so I think we should try and wrap things up. I just have to get to a store and shit.
Absolutely. Thanks for hosting us. I mean, this has been more of a like chat than it has really a debate, I think.
I got
heated at times. I think we got some clarity on what sort of everyone's saying, and I think that we moved past a few things, which is good.
I think I've confirmed a few things for me that I've confirmed my objections a bit, and I think you've confirmed them for me a bit, Bryn. So I'm glad that we've had this conversation. It's been very useful.
I mean, like what I want to like before we do anything like that, like save that for like for the end, and we can talk about whether we have or haven't done anything, and we'll do that in I think the last 10 minutes we'll say. But I guess what I want to say is like what I want to make sure, like, and I know we've got 10 minutes to talk ontology here, but I want to know if there is like if we agree that if there's no nominal problem, if there's no like I'm not going to reject like the logical sound, like the logic within the argument. Like, I'm not saying that the application of logic is wrong if we don't hold the words ontologically to anything. So if we were to say like the word, animal and human are actually just symbols, signifiers, not actually related to a given ontological being, I have no problem. But then, I mean, really, what we've done is made the argument, I think, pretty moot. And I think if you were to say that it is ontologically that we are equalizing, then we'll have an issue. Do you see what I mean? So like, and I think that's Shadow's point as well. So I'm just wondering, do you think there is a valid counter to it breaking Leibniz's law?
I don't even care if you want to call it Leibniz law, because we're just going to end up disagreeing what Leibniz law is.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. I guess.
I want to break it down into brass tacks.
Yeah.
Just like
I think we'll confuse some of the chat if we start getting into whether or not indiscernibility implies identibility and stuff like that. So I think that there's much easier ways we could put this. I think that I'll let Shadow go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So, yeah, and you know what? Because I've been reading the chat and everybody's just like, what the hell is everybody talking about? I'll try again. It's just that when we're talking about, name the trait starts with a given human and a given animal. It says they're different, and we're saying that they have separate existences, right? They're all made up of their own matter. This one's made out of these atoms, that one's made out of those atoms. And that's just one of the propositions that we can say is true of these things. And for name the trait to force contradiction, it really needs to equalize all propositions. Anything you could say is true. So like, there's simple things like one has a tail and one doesn't, right? And then you can just put a tail on the human, and that just seems completely fine, right? It's like, okay, now they're equal in that proposition. But there's the proposition of just like, this one's made out of those atoms and this one's made out of those atoms. And we're trying to find a way to actually equalize this, which is to say that they both have the exact same original atoms that they started with. And that doesn't seem to be a possibility.
They both have the original atoms. I think that the point is that, like, so for example, if we're going from a human into an animal, I think the point is just that at some point, this is actually kind of fun, because I think that you could literally like argue that name the trait's like incoherent on the basis of like chemistry. You could be like like the fact that like these are the specific atoms that make up the structure is contradictory with like certain kinds of traits being flipped. But I think that would be a little bit cheeky. The point
I think that's kind of the point. Like it's the fact that it says a given. What I think we have a problem with is the fact that it says a given human and a given animal are trait equalized, and then that must force a contradiction. If you were to reword that to say that, like, is there a morally relevant distinction? And if you say that there isn't, then and you were to equalize that distinction.
Yeah, but that's just going to go against Ask Yourself's entire idea, which is that any proposition can be morally relevant.
Well,
right?
exactly. But then this is the point. Like, if you're a subjectivist, if you're an absolute subjectivist, especially if you're something like an intuitionist or like a particularist or whatever, there must always be the case that someone could come out and go, like, I just did not value I don't value that iteration within the possible world. And
yeah, so my claim is, though, that if you change this human all the way down to being like, just indiscernible, we'll say, right? Like, you couldn't tell the difference if I shuffled them and presented you them.
Okay.
But we do know that there is an actual, atomized difference. That one's atoms is like the original and the other ones aren't. Then there is a distinction. Somebody could say, well, I can't even tell which one's the real one, but once we figure it out, then that'll be the one I value. Because
I think guys,
let's say that there is intuition pumps to say that this is like something people would choose because somebody gets cloned in some sort of fiction, right? And then the outcome's the identical person. They're like, which one's the original? Right? Even though that they have all the same functionality, for some reason people care about which one were the original atoms. Right?
Yeah, no,
this is
the whole thing.
Right. The other one.
This is the whole thing. Like, I mean, like, just to bring back to Rick and Morty, right, guys? Like, look at it. Like, that episode when the drop, the dad. What's he called? Does anyone remember the dad's name? Jesus. Is it Jerry?
Yeah. But
yeah,
just,
they drop him off at daycare, right? And like, there's a point at the end of the episode where they're like, "Do you have like my Jerry?" Right? Like, and the swap Jerrys, and the idea of it being comical is because it definitely matters who has the right Jerry, but they're like, whatever. Like, if they were entirely equal and indiscernible, like, okay, we would say that like they're of the same value, whatever. But if they are two separate beings there that are being swapped, like, they care about which world they're gonna live in. They want to go back to their world, you know. And the fact is, I think a lot of people do hold that as like a morally valuable like consideration. It's like, if I knew that my mom had been an exact duplicate of my mom had been created, but I couldn't tell the difference between the duplicates, it would, if I could tell the difference, then I would value my original mom. Do you see what I mean?
Okay, well, wait. I think this was mentioned earlier, where there's a difference between valuing something and it being absolutely necessary. And I think this is where name the trait can actually make sense, because, okay, somebody could value deontology, like the history of a being, but I mean, this was something that was discussed in Blade Runner as well. Okay, like, let's say you care about the history, like you're mentioning deontology as the trait. Well, let's just create a hypothetical human that has no history, but they've just been fabricated. Let's say we had a technology to do it like in Blade Runner, and they have artificial memories, and they have the same sentience, intelligence, they can love, feel, whatever, like a human being can, but they don't have the history of a human being. Does it mean it has no moral value anymore?
Oh, well, I completely agree,
Like,
but I would
yeah,
say
so-
that then what you're saying is that there's a
position or not. Well,
Yeah.
I want to address that. Like, vegan gains, you're saying like that seems like a ridiculous position, and even if I agreed it was a ridiculous position that somebody would hold, it doesn't force contradiction. Then
Yeah,
that's
I
the
know.
issue, right?
Sure.
Yeah, that's the point. Like, the fact is,
Wait.
if subjectivism is true, someone could hold that position. It's not that necessarily like I don't think any of us do. Like, I mean, like, for example, 4 of us are vegan, right? I'm pretty sure 4 of us value sentience, right? You know, and like the history of the sentient being. Well, I don't care. But it's whether that a given human is a given animal. Do you know what I mean? And if it's not, then it could be valued differently, and I can value that distinction.
right, but the point is that there's no reason to accept that we have two things at the end. I don't know why we would have to accept that.
But if we only have one thing, if we have, then we're saying
Yeah,
that.
but okay, but if you
kill
say there's
the
only
animal-
one thing, Bryn, then which one was it?
Yeah, it was just like it is the human or the animal. It's just
It was-
whatever we're equalizing into.
It was the atoms. So you're saying it was the atoms that the original human was.
Yeah, just it refers to the same object.
Right. So then I'm not contradictory by saying I value it and I don't value the other one because there is a distinction.
Exactly. Then there was
Right?
never
No,
an
no, no,
animal.
no, 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 no. But no, because now you're saying I value these atoms and I don't value these atoms.
How am I doing that?
No.
You
because-
haven't equalized. That's the problem.
Yeah, that's the issue. Like you've removed the process. You've removed the iterations. What you've said is that
Because
we've
we
ended
can have only one thing at the end and still simultaneously have had two things at the beginning.
Yeah, but that means that one of the things just disappeared and wasn't actually
Yeah,
equal.
that's the thing. That's the
No,
thing.
they
but
don't-
no, but no,
Because
but
the whole point
it
of
was
equalizing is for them both to share something. And now they're not both sharing something. One is just disappearing. That's
Like,
different
yeah.
than saying they both share it, which is what every
just-
other iteration
but
seems to have
it's
done.
it's disappearing from like our perception, but I think there's an interpretation where it's still a thing, right? So the idea is just like if we think about this so like in terms of us comparing,
But it can't be an
things-
interpretation of it, like not to interrupt, but it can't be just an interpretation. It's just a thing because we said that if it exists and it is and if it's distinct but indiscernible, so like it does hold a different identity but it's indiscernible, then that's the epistemic difference and it could be valued. And so what this is to do is to resolve that, and by saying that there is only one thing. So like it's not that like what this would be doing is by saying that there is actually just one. Like not that we can't see a difference, but there is actually just one. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, that. I think that's fine. That they can say that, and then it would be nonsense to say that this one thing has the value and
But
also
that's-
does not have the value.
That's the thing, but the nonsense is in P1 in the first place by saying that you're equalizing something to itself, but it's already equal to itself, so it hasn't undergone a process. Do you see what I mean? Like you'd
Yeah,
be
that's
saying
fine.
A equals A, you wouldn't be saying that if A equals A or if A equals B, then then that would force a contradiction by saying that A equals A. Well, when if you've affirmed A equals A the whole time, you can't say that that has led to a contradiction by saying that you don't value B. Do you see what I mean? Like by saying like that doesn't follow. Like logically, that's the problem.
It absolutely does follow. If at the end of the process you have one object and you say this object has value and doesn't have value, that's pretty clearly a contradiction.
But that's
what the
not
argument's saying.
That's not what it is. Not what it's saying, because it's saying it's being equalized, and there wasn't an equalization, right?
Yep. The equalization occurred in the hypothetical.
No, but it didn't.
But that's the thing.
Yeah, it
couldn't.
We're saying it
occurred.
didn't occur, and it couldn't have occurred.
It couldn't have occurred if it's
equalized
absolutely
both the
equalized. Yeah, exactly.
It absolutely could have, because now again, right, we're talking about like literally really doing this, and that's not what the argument's saying. The argument's saying, look,
I'm talking about hypothetically doing this, and I'm saying you haven't given me a logical hypothetical way of doing this.
Yeah,
Sure,
yeah, exactly. We are rejecting the possibility of this being even hypothetically true.
Sure. So the point is that there is no trait. This is undergoing the equalization process, or this is a state in the equalization process, or this is this thing. And the point is at the end of it, because we don't have any traits that can refer to the process itself, we were just referring to the traits before the process. Then at the end of it, it is contradictory to say that this set of properties and the same set of properties with a different reference.
No, but yeah, but
different.
No, but we're not doing that. It's a different thing than the given animal that we started with.
Yeah. So if we look at
P1,
if we look at P1
Right.
and it says if we say if your view affirms a given human is trait equalizable to a given non-human animal while retaining moral value, then your view can only deny a non-human animal has moral value under pain of P and not P. But they're not denying a non-human animal has moral. They are not denying a non-human animal has moral value. What they are doing is they are affirming that a human has moral value. A given human. Like you see, that doesn't deny the animal because the animal doesn't exist.
Right, but
the animal's not even in the question at the end of it. You're agreeing to this.
Right, because at that point, the contradiction is saying that this human has value and it doesn't have value.
But nobody would have to say that.
They absolutely
They can just say this. They can just say this human has value because it's still the same atoms, and I'm waiting for you to equalize that.
Wait a minute, Brent. I see what you're doing. I think I see what you're doing there.
Yeah, but at no point during the process did the value swap.
But Yeah, but that's exactly right. So, like, I think I see what you're doing there. You're saying that, like, rather than what we would be saying then instead is if your view affirms a given human is trait equalizable to a given human whilst retaining moral value, well, then yes. Like, is it equalizable to itself? Like, what you're saying is that they'll be rejecting the law of identity. Like, you'd be saying that they're not equal to themselves. But the thing is that, like, that would force a contradiction there. Like, but the point is that it's worded in such a way to say that it's a separate thing. If it's not a separate thing, then it shouldn't be worded that way. Like, unless it's purely nominal, which we already agreed. Like, there's no problems if it's purely nominal. Then and it doesn't relate.
But we did agree. Yeah, we did agree that we had two separate ontologies at the start of it, which I think would be a reasonable expectation of anybody being asked this question.
But you can have separate ontologies, and still it is the case that given human and given non-human are just names.
Okay, so there's still names, but we're not addressing the ontologies, which is the thing that I'm naming as the proposition.
Yeah, but it's fine if by the end of it you are now not referring to so ontology is a trait, and at some point you swap the ontology, but you haven't swapped the moral value because the ontology isn't the trait. Then what it is to say is that at the end of the trait equalization process, you have the exact same object, but you have two different moral judgments for it.
But you said it was I asked you if it was the given human. You said it was still the given human. So that hadn't been swapped. That remained constant.
I would also like to say, like, if we look at it like this, right? Like, if we were to say that it is operating in the sense that it's purely nominal.
Remember that given human and given non-human are just names here. The ontology, the ontology is swapped at some point.
Yeah, guys, sorry to like try to like rush things, but like there's only 5 minutes left. I think we should just move on to like closing statements.
Absolutely, guys.
Yeah, I agree.
It's been good. Like, no, I like how civil this has actually been. Like, this has been great. And thank you to Richard as well for having me on.
Yeah, no problem.
So who wants to go first? Shall I go first or?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so just to wrap up my perspective debate,
Just turned
I
into an
changed
hour.
P1 of NTT into if your view of as a human can be identical to a
You've gone
non-human
robotic.
animal,
I have no idea what you're
remove
saying.
the other bits. Can't you hear me?
Yeah, now we can.
Oh, really? Oh, okay. I don't know what happened there. Yeah, so to wrap up my perspective from this debate, I talked about P1 of name the trait. I removed given, and we agreed with, I guess, Bryn's permission. Ask yourself could have some other take on this, but Bryn seemed to agree that be identical to could function in place of the trait equalization process. So we're left with if your view affirms a human can be identical to a non-human animal, right? So that's saying if P can be identical to not P. So from that point of view, in my perspective, Bryn might have a different take on this, but from my perspective, saying P can be identical to not P is just simply a breach of the classical Aristotelian law of identity. So at that point, I just can't comprehend what the trait equalization process is, so I'd need a supporting argument for it to convince me that it's not incoherent nonsense. And that's basically where I am in terms of how I think the argument is useful or not. I don't really think it's useful. I don't think it brings anything new that we can't do with other arguments. I just think it's most people are using what the difference and not understanding name the trait either. Even not they're not using it because they don't even understand it. And when people are actually given the argument, presented with the argument, they don't even they're like what do you say? What true of a what? I don't get it. Can you say that again? So it's just like I don't really see it has any place in the vegan movement. It's just causing confusion and controversy and just argument over it. I just don't think it's necessary. It's not a good argument. That's my take on it. I'm done with NTT now. These guys can now talk about it or have another debate and have the floor.
Yeah, I'm happy to go next if you're cool. We'll make like Bryn go last so that he's got the last word. I think that's fair, especially since there's three of us.
Yeah, it's fair.
What I would say is that if name the trait works on a purely nominal basis, and that if a non-human animal and a given human and a non-human animal are actually just names that we give, and they could be replaced with logical quantifiers such as A and B, then there is no problem here because there is nothing actually there's no confliction occurring. If you're saying if A was B, then you would deny, that you would reach the conclusion. There's no problems there. But the conclusion then wouldn't actually relate to any ontological difference between a given human and a non-human animal. So then we'd be saying that, if you were to work on the premise that you are talking about, why do you value the names? Well, and that these were empty conceptually, particularly, then there wouldn't necessarily, it wouldn't have any value. That's what I'm saying. It would be purely, if it's purely nominal, then we are talking in pure logic, and I just don't see it having any value at all. If it has ontological significance, then the notion of trait equalization, whilst creating a separate human which is indistinguishable in every given sense, meaning that we have the same ontological being from A to B, and that we've only had A to begin with, well, that would break modal logic. It doesn't matter if we create possible worlds. It doesn't matter what we do. We are rejecting, the rule of necessitation, and that's a big problem there. That would make name the trait absolutely useless. So I suggest that what happens with name the trait is that it's reworded. Okay, and that we can either say that it's nominal, which I don't recommend, and I think that we don't want to do that in name the trait because it is more valuable than that. And instead, what we do with name the trait is either make it so that you're naming a morally relevant difference, or you accept that some people will not come out with a contradiction, and in which case it will work no matter what meta-ethic it is. So one, you're either saying that there is a certain meta-ethic in which this will function under, and in the other, you will say that it can work under any meta-ethic, but there is not necessarily a contradiction. And either case, they're fine. I'm going to continue using a change of marginal cases, perhaps, in my own words, because I don't even think the full argument's necessary. And I'm going to make positive claims for veganism, and I think that's a very useful tool as well. So yeah, thank you guys, thank you Vegan Gains, and thank you Bryn for having this conversation.
Okay, Shadow, you want to get next?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, like we've said, I just think this is a big conversation over a wording change, but I do think my position on the necessity of changing the wording is correct if you really want to make sure that your premise is sound. And my position is just that, like, there's this the substance that things are made of is just not being equalized at the end. Because if we're saying that we're getting rid of one of the substances, that's different than an equalization. An equalization is to say two objects now share the same thing, right? And that's what the whole process of the trait equalization process tries to do, even if you say they're separate objects or whatever. If you're saying they're separate, then I'm saying, okay, well then this is a comparison. We're not retaining moral value. All we're doing is comparing different things. I never had a problem against that, but I don't think that the wording of name the trait lends itself to that, and neither does any of the old explanations, which is probably why the wording is the way it is right now. I'm still waiting for an interpretation on how these ontologies are equalized, and until I get that, I don't accept that the problem's been fixed. I don't think the fact that it's in a hypothetical changes anything. I don't think that the difference that it's of the hypothetical or in the hypothetical is a distinction worthy of mentioning, and I haven't heard an argument of why. I just think that it needs to be reworded, and I actually think that the argument can be steel-manned by forcing people to say, well, there has to be an ontological difference. You can't possibly be saying the same object does and doesn't have value, and you can work your way backwards from that to say that it absolutely does have to be a different object, right? And that could be a different substance, that could be whatever. And then you can force someone to say what that difference is. It's just, rather than moving towards this mismatch of a combination of two things, you just start with the premise that they actually just have to be two different things. So deal with it. Yeah, that's my argument.
Sweet. So Foot Soldier asked for an argument. The argument is that if a single object has two names, for example, human and non-human, then we can derive a contradiction. In this case, the object has two names, human and non-human. Therefore, we can derive a contradiction. Perspective philosophy, and I seem to agree to an extent. The problem, of course, is that it isn't the case that name the trait is purely nominal. The nominality of the argument is just with respect to A-hood or B-hood or animal-hood or non-animal-hood. And the point is just that at the point of full equalization, if all we have left are these nominal differences, and so all the ontological characteristics have been equalized, what that would show is that the morality is itself nominal or arbitrary. I don't think that it rejects the necessitation rule. That would require some kind of it would have to be quite a fun argument, but you could try and deliver that argument to me sometime if you want. And then, moreover, yeah, name the trait isn't forceful in a sense because the argument isn't making a case for sentience. You can run that at the same time sideways with it, with like a Coors Guardian argument. Name the trait is Socratic, and it points out that either you're contradictory or you're naming traits that we seem to think are stupid. And the reason why we think it's stupid would have to be argued through some kind of like other argument. And I prefer one like you that is deriving a categorical imperative. With respect to Shadow Starstone, I think Shadow and I agree the most. I think that we agree that either the wording needs to be reframed or at least needs to be further explored. But that we both agree that the very essence of what's going on is coherent, and that the argument's essence doesn't break the law of identity. The argument's essence is something that has pragmatic use. And then my response to the whole thing about substances and whatnot is just that the name at the end just refers to the same substance. So human and non-human would just refer to the same substance. And so you can derive a contradiction, but that I do understand what he means about the lack of the argument explicitly stating that, and that an explicit statement somewhere, either in the dialogue tree or in the argument, that after equalization, you can't derive a contradiction, or you shouldn't derive a contradiction on one object. And moreover, that like the trait equalization process can derive one object. Those are useful features, and that overall that we're looking for is the thing that is different. But overall, it was a good discussion. I think we clarified quite a bit. I'm always happy to discuss more on your guys' other channels. If we want to go on and talk about things like process ontology or the identity of indiscernibles and the indiscernibility of identity in greater depth. And again, thanks for Richard and Jasmine for hosting us and being so patient with our rambles.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
All right, cool.
Thanks, guys.
And if you guys want me to link your
Bye,
channels
everyone.
or anything in the description, just send it to me on like Twitter or whatever.
Awesome.
I would appreciate it. Yeah.
I'll
thanks.
send
cool.
I'll send it to you over Skype probably because
Okay.
I don't have Twitter. But thanks.
Sure. Okay, cool. All right. Well, take care, guys.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks.
Right.
See you
Okay. And now I think what we'll do is just quickly answer some super chats. I have to go soon. Now, first off, Nick Kazmarek donated 99 cents. Didn't have anything to say, but appreciate the donation, Nick. Nightingale donated $2.79. He says, meat is for morons. I'd say not necessarily. My lips are really orange. I would say not necessarily. I'd say a lot of people who eat meat are morons, but there are some people who are really intelligent but just do not care. But yeah, I'd say generally that statement is true. But thanks for the donation, Nightingale. Nick Kazmarek donated another 99 cents. Thanks, Nick. And Denkono donated $2. He said, Sabaton Attack of the Dead Man Gym Power Metal. Okay, I'll check that out. Thanks for the recommendation. Appreciate it. And thanks for the donation, dude. Okay, I've got to get going. We're going to turn around the entire apartment. I'm going to move my office recording room into the bedroom because it's a bigger space and it's kind of beneficial for me. But thanks, guys. Thanks for checking out the stream. Probably not going to stream again tonight just because I'm going to be busy. But big thanks to everyone who donated in the super chat. Hope you guys enjoyed yourselves. And yeah, have a good evening.